have a friend who's thinking of transferring to the university. He's in first one. So basically, he says he really wants to work hard in the coaches. But that's an incentive to work hard. Otherwise, you can fail. Get it into CGAA for the first year. It doesn't count towards your degree. I want to brag. Yeah, to cover everything. Can't go for banking. Do you read up on the rules? It's basically foreign trade. It is new, but foreign trade.
Did anyone go to the LSC event that I mentioned about GDP? You? How many?
Oh, the guys on the way.
Okay. How did you find it?
It was okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Will you go to LSC events in the future?
No, I will not.
You will.
The only thing is in person in another room. They streamed it through Skype. And at the time it was freezing.
Oh, okay. So you couldn't get through the main.
No, it was
Hello, hello. Is it? I guess it's working fine. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't see.
It's working fine. Yeah. Because last time we increased it and the sound was very high.
It's too high, was it? Okay.
I reduced it a little bit here.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it should be fine here.
I think it's fine. It's fine as long as when you're speaking at your strongest, that it goes into the yellow. What we don't want is for it to stay in the
As long as it's in the green, it's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But obviously, it's difficult for you to see that while you're talking because your PowerPoint is up.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Patrick.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
It's enough time. It's okay. I just want to get down to like 50.
Finish about 10 to 5 to 3. Maybe usually. Okay. Well, if you leave that here, because I will come back and find
Same here, actually. I just called this
We'll start in 3 minutes. Okay, let's start. Now, this week's lecture and the next week's are going to be the most exciting ones because it puts everything together so far we've discussed in the course. We're going to talk about foreign trade today, designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. Why study this topic? Obvious. We live in the age of globalization. Think about the things you're wearing right now, the gadget in your pocket, this table, this computer. Everything in this room, and that computer. Yes, everything in this room has been produced in different countries around the world. Every stage of the production have been outsourced in different countries, from rich countries to middle-income countries to poor countries. I would bet you can hardly find a product which has been produced in one country, every component. That is almost impossible nowadays. So, the lecture has 3 parts today. I'm going to talk about trends in trade openness since 1950. I'm going to discuss what do I mean by trade openness in a minute. Then we're going to talk about arguments in favor of trade openness, that they say trade openness to trade cause long-term economic growth, technological catch-up, and we're going to look at arguments against trade openness. Arguments that says, openness to trade does not automatically bring you prosperity in the long term. So let's start with some facts. Okay. Before going to facts, what do we mean by openness to trade? When we say a country is open to trade, it basically means that it is open to inflow and outflow of goods. It is open to imports and exports. It doesn't have import restrictions like high tariff rates, like a lot of custom duties, import taxes. Also, it doesn't have any restrictions on exports. Now, you can obviously think why a country imposes restrictions on imports, because first of all, tariffs and import tax brings a lot of revenue to the government, okay? It's a money issue. Secondly, high import tariffs usually protect the domestic industries. Now, why some countries have export restrictions sometimes? Any idea? Yes?
Well, I think historically it is China who did it in the 19th century, and it was because of political reasons.
What do you mean, export restrictions on what?
So they had products which Europe didn't have, and they didn't want to share their knowledge about those products.
Okay. The best example of it is, like, do you remember 4 or 5 years ago, the price of food was very high. Many poor countries introduced export restrictions on food. Their countries were not allowed to export food because they wanted to increase the domestic supply of food. You know, the food that we produced had to be sold to the domestic consumers, not to the foreign consumers. So sometimes you put export restrictions on food, for instance, or on technological goods. You don't want the other countries to know the technology. So basically, openness to trade, that means you remove all these restrictions. Now, how do we measure it? One is direct measures. We look at the tariff rates. Does the country have a high tariff rate, like 20%, 40%, 50%? Do they have high import taxes? Do they have like non-tariff barriers, like, you know, bureaucratic barriers? If you want to sell a good to a country, that country has to meet a lot of standards, you know, get this and that, and this going to take a lot of time, you know, it's going to increase the expense of exporting goods to the other country. So tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, these are direct measures. Sometimes it's very hard to measure these things in a country, so we simply do an indirect measure. If we want to see if one country is open to trade or not, we just look at the amount of trade that country is doing. Is that country trading a lot? If it's trading a lot, then we can assume that, okay, it is open to trade. So sometimes we indirectly measure it by the amount of trade that that country is doing, the exports and the imports, compared to the size of that economy, the total income. Okay? Any questions on this? Openness to trade, how do we measure it? Now let's look at the stats in the history. Let's take a long sweep. Let's go back to 19th century, at the beginning of Industrial Revolution. Now what does this graph tell us? This graph tells us the amount of world imports to the total GDP. Okay? What do we mean by that? That how much countries were trading with each other compared to the overall size of the economies of every country put together. Okay. Now bear in mind that someone's imports is another person's exports. Always. Okay. I export goods to your country, my export the same amount of value of goods, your imports. Okay, so basically it doesn't matter when we put imports or exports here for the world. Because for the world as a whole, import of each country is the export of another country. So this tells us that in the 19th century, at the beginning, you had the rise of trade. The first era of globalization. As you see the percentage, the importance of trade in the overall economy is increasing. A higher percentage of income is earned by exporting goods to the other countries. Now, this was a Victorian era, first wave of globalization. In that era of globalization, mainly poor countries were focused on exporting raw materials to rich countries. So they were specialized in export of raw materials here. And the rich countries were producing manufactured goods. Poor countries, you know, they were colonized, exporting raw materials to London. You get those raw materials in London, let's say cotton, and you produce textiles. And then you sell it to your domestic market or you export it back to India and developing countries. Now then, this era of Victorian globalization, where most of the trade was happening between rich countries, ended with World War I. In World War I, you see a decline in trade, and then after World War II, then we see a revival after World War II. the trade starts to grow at the global level again. And then in the 1960s, we have a sudden surge. This is the so-called second wave of globalization that we're living in now. It has lasted until then. The countries have lowered their tariff rates, both rich countries and developing countries, and they're trading a lot with each other. Now, this tells you the total amount of trade that was happening at the global level. After World War II, the trade basically increased from about, let's say, $1 trillion in 1948 to about $20 trillion today. Increase of 20-fold. Amazing. And most of this basically were due to many reasons. Some of it were due to technological advancements. Basically, the cost of shipping has dropped. So it's easier to export goods. Internet has basically reduced the management of production between different countries. Basically, you can, if you're a producer of good here, you can outsource some of production of some of your parts to other countries, and by internet, you track how outsourcing is going. The cost of communication between the different, basically, networks of production have dropped. Also, other than technological developments, basically, you also had a lot of technological developments in shipping as well. Beside these technical factors, there was a policy factor as well. Since 1980s, rich countries had deliberately focused on reducing tariff rates and encouraging trade. So, the increase in the 20-fold increase in trade during the past, 7 decades have been the outcome of both technological developments in transportation and communication, and also changes in policy. Now, let's look at the overall trade that is happening. Let's look at the exports. Okay, this is the absolute amount. It breaks down the export of every country by their sector. Are they exporting manufacturing goods? Are they exporting natural resources like oil, raw materials, and commodities? Are they exporting agricultural goods like coffee, banana? Now, as you can see, developed countries have most of the trade, and most of these trades are in manufacturing. After that is East Asia. Most of these trades is in manufacturing. Then South Asia we have here. Again, most of the trade is in manufacturing, natural resources. The interesting thing is Sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the trade is in raw materials and natural resources. Most of their exports. Any questions? So most of the trade is done by developed countries, followed after East Asia. Then we have South Asia here, the lowest Sub-Saharan African countries. And Sub-Saharan African countries are mostly focused on export of natural resources and agriculture. Now, this gives you an overview of the evolution of what's happening at the tariff rates in the global world. Can someone give an idea what do we mean by tariff rates here again?
The leverage based on imports.
Sorry?
The leverage based on imports.
Leverage.
It was like percentage of basically a form of tax.
It's a form of tax, percentage. If this iPhone costs £100, okay, if you want to import it to UK, the import duty is 20%, then the price of this will go down to £120. The £20 has to go to the UK government. So that is the effective tariff rate of 20%. So basically, it increases the cost and increases the price of that good by 20%. The tariff rate of 13% increases the price of the import goods by the 13%. Okay, so you could see after World War II, you had GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which were mainly directed by the USA in order to reduce the trade, in order to increase and encourage trade between countries, especially countries in the Western sphere, in order to have a closer integration between countries where we're against communism. So you have a drop in tariff rates here. Different rounds of trade talks between, happening at the international level, which focuses on reducing tariff rates in both rich countries and poor countries. Now, the main thing that you have to keep in mind is the WTO, World Trade Organization, being born out of this organization. Since WTO had been born in 1994, you had a tremendous drop in tariff rates. World Trade Organization, which is a multilateral international organization, has been critical in basically forcing the reduction of tariff rates in different countries, both rich countries and developing countries. Any questions? Now, let's look at the tariff trends in the different regions. The highest tariffs were for West Asia. It has dropped since 1990. Now it's still more than 10%. Then followed by Africa. The tariff rates were about 30%, has declined to about 15%. And this is for other regions. So what it clears is that you have a drop in tariff rates basically during the past 30 or 40 decades, and the amount of trade has been going up. This shows you basically, again, another indicator, an indirect indicator of trade openness. If the amount of trade in a country is high, that means this country is exporting and importing a lot relative to the overall size of its economy, then we can say that that country is open to trade. Otherwise, it wouldn't have this large amount of imports and exports. So, judging by this measure, the total amount of your imports and exports expressed as a percentage of your overall economy, then we can see, the amount of openness to trade in different regions. Of course, we have Europeans at the top, then followed by East Asian countries, Sub-Saharan country, and then South Asia. South Asia being way below. Now, let's not be fooled by Sub-Saharan Africa. Again, the amount of trade is high, but a lot of this trade is in the exports of raw materials. If we go to the next graph, we will see this. This tells you the amount of export of Africa to developed economies and developing Asia. Okay, as you see, most of this percentage, the bulk of these export is fuel and raw materials here. Fuel and raw materials. And through time, this is the interesting case because yes?
In the previous slide, I have a question. The year shows between around 2007. Wasn't there a financial crisis?
Yeah.
How come there's an increase in the trade as percentage of GDP?
That's a drop. That's actually for that's after the crisis. This drop is because of after the crisis.
Oh, so that's 2006.
Yeah, you need to, this doesn't show you accurately. Okay, sometimes. So this drop is because of financial crisis, and it's natural because you have an interconnected world. Okay, when the rich countries sneeze, then the developing countries are in trouble because of interconnectedness. Okay, and that's because of this reason. When you're exporting a lot, especially East Asia is a good example. China, as you remember, earns about 40% of its income, total income, by exporting goods to other countries. So it's highly dependent on exports, okay? So if something goes wrong in the global economy, they're in trouble. And you have a very hard beat in East Asian economies. Any other question? Now, as I was mentioning, most of the trade from Sub-Saharan Africa to other countries is in the raw materials, and especially during the last decade, the price of raw materials have been increasing a lot because of the Chinese growth. China is growing, it needs a lot of raw material for its industrialization, that the price of raw materials have been increasing. So the value of the raw materials have been increasing a lot. Yes?
Is that indicating changes in
Value. Yeah, changes in value. Because basically, the capacity, the amount of your export is not increasing high, but the price of them have been increasing. So your export value has been increasing. Any other question? Okay, so what do we have so far? The general trend that we learned is this, basically. A revival of trade, and after World War II, and especially since 1980s, you had a surge in trade globalization and a reduction in tariff rates. So we live in a world that is becoming more and more open to trade between countries. Now, the main question, is openness to trade good for long-term economic growth or not? Is openness to trade good for long-term economic growth, technological learning, technological catch-up or not? Now, this is probably the most important slide of the day. Openness to trade brings you two things. On the one hand, it exposes your whole economy to competition, because all countries can access your markets. They can export goods to your markets. Okay? But on the other hand, trade gives you access to foreign markets. If you're good at producing, you have access to foreign markets. And this is very important basically for developing countries, because most of the time their internal markets is not rich. They're poor countries, they're developing. So the size of their overall market is not very big. By the virtue of the exports and trading, they can access richer markets. Imagine a market for cars in Peru, okay, a poor Latin American country, is not a big market. Okay? But foreign trade allows you access to richer markets outside. Now, combination of this gives incentive to domestic entrepreneurs to find the sector that their country is able to compete globally. They find that sector, they invest in it, they ask foreign companies to come over and create a joint venture. They learn the technology and they produce more efficiently and they go global. So, the combination of competition and access to foreign markets give incentive to domestic entrepreneurs to first identify the sectors that their country can compete in, invest in that sector, transfer and learn the technology in that sector from foreigners, and try to perfect and master the technology in order to compete at the global level. And basically build global companies, global brands. Most of the global brands that we have today, Toyota, LG, all focused on the same path. Yes, Ahmed? We will talk about this. We will talk step by step. Any questions on this? Okay. Now, the question is of which sector are developing countries able to compete in? Are they able to compete in agriculture and commodities, labor-intensive industries, or capital-intensive industries and knowledge-intensive industries? Well, probably most of you know the answer. But how do we tell? It depends on their factor endowments. Okay, developing countries, for instance, most of the sub-Saharan African countries have a lot of land. Some of them have a lot of minerals. Almost all developing countries had a large pool of unskilled labor. However, because they're not developed and they don't have a lot of money for investment, they don't have a high stock of physical capital. They don't have the latest, infrastructure and the latest machinery, of course. And also because they're poor, they don't have the means to buy these and accumulate a lot of physical capital. And also, because they're not developed, they don't have a lot of money on investing in education, basically. So for developing countries, their stock of physical capital is low and human capital is low as well. So they can compete in sectors that they don't require a lot of these factors. And that is the labor-intensive industries and agriculture. The labor-intensive industries require a lot of labor. Developing countries have it. The cost of labor is so low because the stock of unskilled labor is high. So production of goods that they require a lot of labor is cheaper in developing countries. The wages are lower. So the direct cost of producing a shoe, which is a labor-intensive good, is lower in China because you have a lot of low-skilled labor now. Now, actually, it's increasing in China nowadays. It's going to Ethiopia. Yeah. Now, with agriculture and commodities, a lot of developing countries have a lot of land and minerals, so they can produce these things at a cheaper price. However, when it comes to capital-intensive industries like production of steel, production of cheap computer chips, semiconductors, car engines, these require a lot of physical capital and an educated workforce. And these two factors are very scarce in developing countries. Therefore, the cost of them are very high. The price of them are very high. And therefore, the cost of producing knowledge-intensive industries and capital-intensive industries are very high in developing countries. Okay. This theory was first developed. The first person that realized this was Adam Smith. He basically said that some countries are able to produce some stuff at a lower cost than the others. So let's outsource those things to other countries so both countries can benefit. If I can produce this cheaper than you, and you can produce this cheaper than me, okay, you specialize on production of this, I specialize on production of water, then we trade. We both produce more, okay? Therefore, we both consume more. We're better off. Now, Sam, could you read this quote for us in a dramatic way? Where's Sam? Yeah.
Openness to trade forces countries to specialize in sectors in which they have a cost advantage over other countries. Reciprocal free trade enables countries to produce more and therefore consume more through specialization.
If you specialize on something that you have a cost advantage, you can produce a lot of goods in that sector. You can export more, therefore you can import more. You can consume more. So by specialization, everyone will be better off. What do we mean by reciprocal free trade? Trade between me and Ahmad. He's open to the export of water. I'm open to the export of presentation sticks. Okay? Now, let's see this in action. The theory of competitive absolute advantage. This was the theory of absolute advantage. What do we mean by absolute? That means the cost of producing something is lower than the other country. The direct cost of producing this is lower in my country than the direct cost of producing the presentation stick. Okay. Now let's see this theory in action. Let's go to a real world example. Again, to the production stages of Zara. Okay. The t-shirt that we're all wearing is the product of different stages of production. Now, if you're Zara, you know that the t-shirt requires raw materials, cotton. Then, to produce a t-shirt, that cotton has to be transformed into cloth. Then those cloth had to be cut and assembled to a t-shirt according to the design made by the designer. Okay, so you have different stages. Raw materials being transformed into cloth, and then you have the sewing, and then the final stage, retailing and marketing. Now, Zara outsources some of these stages to other countries because the cost of producing these stages is lower in other countries. The theory of absolute advantage in our everyday life. Some stages of production are cheaper in other countries, so let's outsource that part to another country. Examples, let's buy the cotton from Cameroon. Why? Because the cost of getting cotton inside Spain is infinite, because we don't have that raw material. So Cameroon has a cost advantage when it comes to supplying the cotton. The next stage, let's outsource the transformation of turning cotton into cloth in Bangladesh. Why? Because they can do it at a lower cost, because the cost of labor there is much lower than the cost of labor in Spain. Finally, let's give the cloth to the people in the Bangladesh to turn them into t-shirts according to our designs. Why? Again, because the cost of sewing and this stage of production is lower in Bangladesh than in Spain. And finally, when the cloth is produced, we will do the marketing and retailing it in-house. Okay? So basically, you have the specialization there. Cameroon specializes in export of raw materials, Bangladesh in weaving and labor-intensive industries, and finally Spain on doing the knowledge-intensive part of it, and retailing and marketing. Everybody is better off. Why? Because Cameroon can export a lot of its raw materials to a rich market. Okay? Bangladesh can export a lot of labor-intensive goods. Therefore, they can consume more, they can import more. You export, you produce, therefore you earn money for consumption, for imports. They are better off. And finally, Zara is better off. Why? Because you can lower the cost of producing t-shirts in your company and make more profit. And here, finally, the consumers, as consumers, we're all better off. Why? Because we have to pay a lower price for our Zara t-shirts. Any questions? The theory of absolute advantage. You outsource the stages of production that can be done cheaper elsewhere. I'll get to the other theory you mentioned in a minute. Another example, iPhones. The best short line of foreign trade. You know, everybody's better off. You know, designed in California, assembled in China. Now, to produce an iPhone, as we mentioned, it needs a different stages of production, from raw materials. Most importantly, you have to produce the computer chip, which is mainly the brain of the iPhone. And together with the other components, you assemble them, and finally you put software on them and you market them. Different stages of production. Okay. Now, again, some stages of these production can be done cheaper in other countries. For instance, raw materials. To produce a computer chip, you need silicon. Okay? The price of getting silicon in the US is infinite because you don't have any silicon. South Africa has. Okay? So they can export the silicon to your company in Texas in the US. You take that silicon and you produce these chip wafers. Okay? A very knowledge-intensive task of production, and also very capital-intensive. And you produce computer chips with it, the brain of the iPhone. However, when it comes to assembling this computer chip with other components, you outsource this stage to China. because it's a labor-intensive stage. It requires a lot of labor to assemble this, and this can be done by unskilled workers. So the cost of doing this in China is much more lower than doing this in California. So why not outsource this? You outsource this to Foxconn in China. Finally, when the product is assembled, you do the software, you put the software, you do the marketing and retailing, the knowledge-intensive part of the production. You sell it. Again, the theory of absolute advantage. Every country that specializes in the thing that they could produce cheaper than the others. South Africa on raw materials, US on producing computer chips, China on assembling the iPhone, and again, US on software, marketing, and retailing. Everybody is better off. Any questions? Simon?
All right. So if you're outsourcing all the labor-intensive tasks to where it's cheaper to perform these tasks, what happens to a low skilled worker in a wealthy nation? Like if you didn't go uni and you didn't.
We'll come to that. You'll become worse off.
Yeah.
We'll come to that in a minute. Okay? Okay? But then again, we'll come, bear with me. We need to go step by step. Okay? Now, this is Terry Gu, an entrepreneur who spots this opportunity in China, a Taiwanese entrepreneur. He spotted this opportunity that, look, we can assemble these goods in China at a lower cost than the other places. So he basically chased Apple and basically gave this offer to them that they outsourced the assembly of iPhones into China. Now let's watch a short video about this, very short, about the factory in Foxconn, and interestingly, it has, I think,
It changes the experience. So how many steps are there?
Around 141.
141 steps. But it is time now to think different about it.
This is assembly, 141 steps of assembly, each person doing one stage, you know.
Apple, because here it is. This is where your iPhone was born, and these are the people who brought it to life. My name is Bill. Nice to meet you. I'm first struck by how young they are. Not 13 like some of the horror stories I heard, but 17, 18. No one looked over 30. I know many came from poor villages out in the countryside with the hope of making $2 an hour, but their haircuts prove that teen style lives everywhere. I was expecting more automated assembly, more robots, but the sleek machines that dazzle and inspire and change the lives of people 8 to 80 are mostly made by hand, after hand, after hand. Behold the camera module for the iPad.
That was the labor-intensive way of producing it. Now, here comes, let me double check whether this is recording. Yeah. Now, question. You have to pay attention to this. This is a very interesting case. Now imagine that Apple decides to do the assembly part of iPhone in the US in-house. However, Apple says that I'm going to use a lot of machinery, robots, and skilled labor to do this, so that I could reduce the cost of assembly comparing to China. So basically they said that if we use a lot of machinery and skilled labor, we can do this cheaper than Chinese in-house. Do they still have to outsource it to China? Even if that they can produce it, they can assemble iPhones cheaper in the US by using machinery and educated labor. Yes?
They're outsourcing for the least profitable parts of production. So
What is the opportunity cost of doing this in-house? What is the opportunity cost of Apple assembling iPhone? What is Apple missing by doing this? Yes?
The full vulnerability of the skilled workers, they'd be better used doing something that wasn't like an unskilled worker could do. So they
Okay.
could better profit elsewhere.
What do you mean by elsewhere?
So if they did something knowledge intensive in terms of like software and marketing.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Each knowledge worker and the machinery that you're putting here, it's a knowledge worker and a machinery that you're taking away from here. Opportunity cost. So the question is that can they produce more profit for the company in here or in here? Basically, in here. So, the Apple thinks that, okay, even if I use a lot of machinery and can assemble iPhones cheaper than the Chinese, I will still be better off if I focus all my resources on a part of business which brings me more profit. Focusing on my resources on this basically has an opportunity cost, because I can use every knowledge worker or every machinery to a more profitable use. So basically, doing this has a high opportunity cost for Apple. It diverts attention from more profitable part of the business. This law was first discovered by David Ricardo, the theory of comparative advantage, which in my opinion is the most difficult theory in economics. If you come out of this lecture really understanding this, it will be a big milestone for me, honestly. It took me many, many years to understand it. Okay, Shamina. Would you read the direct code for us?
We can't see.
You can't see, okay. Any volunteers? No volunteers? May I know your name? Teresa. Would you be able to read the code for us?
Even when one firm, country, can produce everything cheaper than another firm.
Then another firm, sorry.
It can still benefit from trade by outsourcing the less profitable parts of its business, which have high opportunity costs, to the other firm, country. This allows the outsourcing firm to focus its entire resources, labor, human capital, and physical capital, on the most profitable parts of its business.
Question, Luke?
But in many, so for example, the US, there is spare output capacity and unemployed skilled labor. So there isn't necessarily an opportunity cost.
Okay, let's say, then again, unemployed skilled labor. If you employ new labor, a new person, skilled labor, okay, would that person produce more profit for you if you put him here or here?
In the second.
In the second. So the law still applies. Okay? So you could produce more profits by buying machinery and investing your educated workforce and the physical capital here than here. That's the law of comparative advantage. It says that even if one country or firm can produce everything better than the other, there's still gains to be made by specialization and trade. Any questions? Now, if you look at it here, on which sectors developing countries have a comparative advantage in, again, labor-intensive and agricultural commodities. Why? Because if they put their resources here, they don't forego a lot of income. A Chinese laborer who's doing assembly, a labor-intensive job, is not productive if it's placed in a knowledge-intensive industry or capital-intensive industry. However, imagine it for a rich country. Producing these have a high opportunity cost because every unit of labor and machinery and infrastructure you devote to agriculture and labor intensive industries is a unit of labor and capital that you're taking away from these. So basically, what have we learned so far is that developing countries have an absolute advantage, and sometimes, rephrase it, what have we learned so far is that the direct and indirect cost of producing labor-intensive and agriculture and commodities are lower in developing countries than richer countries. So it is better for developing countries to specialize in here, and it's better for rich countries to specialize in here. Now, any questions? We have 2 slides, and then we will have a break. Yes?
Is it always everyone's better off, or can you have luck? Because what if prices can fluctuate? And also,
I didn't understand the question.
Phrase it wrong. If you've got a country which is producing, it might be better to produce it in-house because prices can change in up the time.
Exactly. The next slide. What happens in the long term?
Pretty nothing.
I'll let you know. Does your price of labor stays the same in China in the long term? No, it increases. That's the thing. Free marketeers, people who are advocating trade openness, they say, look, things change in the long term. At the beginning, you can compete in these sectors. However, as time goes by, you compete in sectors, you become richer and richer. You accumulate savings, then you can do investment in physical capital. You can build infrastructure. You can buy machineries. You can educate your workforce. So gradually, you can move away from here to here as you become richer. So it's a dynamic process. You start with labor-intensive industries. You become richer. Naturally, you lose your competitiveness in those sectors. However, by becoming rich, you can accumulate capital, both physical and human, and move to the upper stages of production. So the advocates of free trade say that, look, this will happen automatically, step by step. Just open up your economy to trade. You start by competing in these sectors. You lose your competitiveness after a while. However, you become rich enough and you slowly move into these sectors. So basically, by following this, is that you start with here, you become rich, and you can slowly do the computer chips and also marketing and retailing. You move from low ends, low productivity parts of the production change into more profitable parts of the production change. So in a nutshell, the technological learning and the industrial upgrading happens automatically in the long term, according to people who advocate openness to trade. All these things happen automatically. You have an advantage in here due to competitiveness. You learn the technology. You have an incentives, okay, to become better and better and compete globally, build global brands. However, as you become richer, you move to a more sophisticated parts of producing an iPhone or a t-shirt. So this was basically the economic benefits of it. The economic benefits of trade openness in the long term, it leads to structural change. You master each of these sectors and you move up the chain of production. You move up from low profitable parts to more profitable parts. Now, other than economic benefits, advocates of openness to trade, they said that, look, there are non-economic benefits as well. There are political benefits. The countries that trade with each other, the chance of conflict breaking out between them is lower. And also trade enriches culture, because in the end of the day, when two countries trade with each other, there would be a lot of interaction anyway, and you automatically exchange cultures. Now, any questions on this? Let's have a 5-minute break. Thank you. Just a second. Gabriel. We'll just want to make sure.
Oh, yeah.
Bear with me. Yeah. Yep. Because the idea here is that if you open up some of the sectors that are not profitable, you cannot continue. However, sectors, labor-intensive sectors, agriculture, will flourish. Why? Because you're able to. So because it says if you start free trade, definitely at a low level of income, you're able to compete here, but these industries you're not able to compete. If you have them, they'll go bankrupt. Can you compete with production of car with a Toyota in Japan? No. On the free trade, you lose out.
To be a less supply, the same demand. So eventually people will move back the other way. Think about what basically everything will become capital intensive. How is everyone produced?
How USA does it? Do they use a lot of machinery? You see, so in a way, you could produce this in a labor-intensive way or technology. As every country does it, we don't have, cheap labor anymore. So what do? We have to produce everything with a lot more machines. Make everything capital intensive.
Be afraid.
Yes, that's what you need to be brave.
The more machines you use. So what happens to wages?
Well, it goes back to science. If you're skilled, there's a better option. Unskilled, you don't have
Surely what's happening of all people everyone
That's the thing. People, advocates of free trade, justify that. They're saying, look, because the country has overall benefits, the winners compensate the losers. The skilled worker compensates the unskilled, right? Because as a whole, we still benefit. Okay, you earn more income. Okay. You can win it. It is better for the country that you pay a bit of it as a tax. You still earn more. It's whole standards. Exactly. The winners compensate for all these.
In the topic because of this one, but I think we're going to what happened you argue that the bank is just that's what I'm going to say.
I'm going to talk about the exact thing. You're specialized in agriculture and rapidly manufactured goods. What if the price of manufactured goods are increasing relative to agriculture? You know, we're talking about that.
You argue that you can safeguard yourself, can't you? Because
Yeah, we will talk about these. Okay. Again, all of them arguments against. Okay. Okay. Let me do a recap. Of the argument. Before going to arguments against trade openness, let me do a recap for arguments for trade openness. The slide is this simply this slide summarizes the argument of that side. It says, look, open up your economy to trade. If you're developing countries, you will be able to compete in these sectors and master the technology in each of them. Master the skill in assembling of iPhones. You become better at it. Because of the forces of competition, you master the technology and you go global. You can access a lot of rich markets. And because of the low cost of labor and commodities in agriculture and land in your economy, you're able to produce these things cheaper. As you become richer, you can accumulate physical capital and human capital and move up the ladder of comparative advantage. This happens in the long term. Your competitiveness sector changes and evolves over time as you become rich. Now, what is the problem with that? Arguments against trade openness. First of all, it says, look, this process doesn't happen automatically. Technological and organizational learning takes time in every sector. In every sector. Even if it's assembly of iPhone, it needs knowledge. You remember this Taiwanese entrepreneur who built the Foxconn in China. Taiwan was doing the exact thing that China is doing today 30 years ago. They were assembling electronic products for Sony, for richer countries, actually. So they mastered the technology. However, they moved on to producing more sophisticated parts. Now this guy transferred the knowledge and the skill to the company Foxconn in China. The knowledge of assembling electronic goods. You remember the assembly line, 130 steps? That needs knowledge, and that requires learning over time. This guy transferred that to that firm. So in whichever sector, you cannot adopt the technology overnight and start to compete. No, learning takes time. Okay? So if you're exposed to international competition, you cannot learn. You cannot compete. So the idea is that technological and organizational learning takes time. Therefore, protect and support your infant firms first, and once they master the technology, expose them to international competition. This idea was first introduced by Friedrich List. You remember, the German political economist. The argument against free trade: look, any sector needs learning. So if you have an infant sector, supports it first, allow that to master the technology, and then expose it to international competition. So therefore he says this doesn't happen automatically. You cannot adopt the technology here and compete overnight and become rich and then move up. No, that doesn't happen. In a way, you can summarize his argument in a graph. It says, look, you can become more and more efficient in time as you produce more of that good. Okay, so if you're an infant industry, you don't know a lot the technology and the skills at the beginning. Your organization is infant. However, by doing that, you get to learn and you become better and better, and you reduce the cost of production. Learning by doing. The best analogy is driving. Okay, you cannot just buy a car and just sit in it and drive. No. And no, the instructor cannot basically teach you the instruction and give you the instructions. You know, this is how you use this technology. No, you have to drive, and you learn by doing. It's exactly the same in every industry. You get to learn the skills and the technology. The organization learns by doing. You cannot adopt the skills overnight and compete globally. You need a breeding room at the beginning. You learn, and then you can go global. Any questions? Sorry? No? So, this doesn't happen automatically. Each stage needs learning. And the learning cannot take place under free trade and international competition. The learning can take place under protection. The second argument against free trade, trade openness, is that if you open your economy to trade, you specialize in agriculture and commodities. This is the case with many sub-Saharan African countries. They have a lot of commodities and a lot of land, a lot of unskilled labor. So if they open up, the only sector that they can compete is the agriculture and commodities. However, the opponents of free trade, they say that, look, these sectors are low income generating sectors. If you specialize in them, you get locked. You never go up. These sectors produce very little income. Think about the Starbucks. You pay $2.20 for this. How much of the $2.20 goes to the exporter of coffee in Cameroon? How much of it? About 10 pence. 10 pence of it only goes to this sector, the coffee producer. A very low income generator. Most of the income goes in here. The retail, the Starbucks coffee shop around the corner that is responsible for giving you the experience and the branding. The company that processed the coffee, and is usually in rich countries. Okay? Very little of it going in here. It's the same with Zara t-shirt. How much of it, of 12 pounds, goes to the person who supplied the cotton for this shirt? Very low. Most of the 12 pounds goes in here. knowledge-intensive sectors. So basically, the agriculture and commodities are very low income generating sectors. We call them low value added sectors. They trap you if you specialize it. You never become rich. Now, the question is why? Why so little of these £2 trickle down to the coffee exporter? Jacob?
A lot of people can produce coffee.
Yeah, a lot of competitors. And this is the product supply side of the market for coffee. Demand side, who buys the coffee?
Well, there's this fact that says the populations get richer, they can produce coffee.
Who buys the raw coffee and process it? Yes? Yeah. 4 or 5 coffee firms. They buy the raw coffee and process it. 4 or 5 firms. So you have a market that have a lot of suppliers on one side and very few buyers on the other side. So basically, the bargaining power of the coffee producers are very low. So they cannot bargain for a higher price. So they have low market power. And also, there's another part. They get to do a stage of production that adds not a lot of value for the customer. Look, the main thing that you go and drink coffee in the Starbucks is part of the branding and the identity and the experience. Sometimes the quality of the coffee is not that important. I bet that we cannot tell the difference of the quality of the coffee between so many coffees that we drink. If they blindfold us and you test different coffees, we cannot tell. So the main reasons that we choose this product over the other one is the branding and the marketing and the experience. These stages produce a lot more value to the customer. This is also the same with t-shirt. The main part that a designer can charge a lot for the t-shirt is the marketing and the branding. That is the main premium. That is the part of the business that if you get it right, if you get the brand loyalty, you can charge a high price. So basically, due to these factors, agriculture and commodities usually have low market power. The suppliers in these sectors have low market power. There are a lot of suppliers and few number of buyers. And also, they get to produce things that don't have a lot of value to the customer. Look, if you become richer and richer, you don't get to produce premium bananas, right? It's not part of your identity. But you get to consume premier clothes. It's part of your identity, okay? So one of the troubles with agriculture and commodities is that, look, it's not part of the identity of the consumer, okay? It's just a commodity. It's salt. It's very difficult to convince a person to pay a large premium for a different salt. So the idea is that these are low income generating sector. If you specialize in them, if you open up, okay, you get trapped. This was first discovered by Raoul Purvis, Latin American economist, probably the most famous development economist who was coming from a developing country, Argentina. Raoul Purvis. And together with another economist, Hans Singer, they discovered that specialization in agriculture and commodities is a bad idea. These sectors are low income generating. And their hypothesis, their idea, was called after them, Purbish and Singer hypotheses. They discovered something interesting. They said, look, in the long term, the price of agriculture and commodity goods are falling relative to manufactured goods. So if you're specializing in export of these, you're in trouble. Okay? Because as a developing country, you have to export these and import these because you're not producing them in-house. You're in trouble. The price of your exports is falling relative to the price of your imports. You're in trouble. And this is the evidence for that. Look at the past 5 decades. This is the price of commodities relative to manufactured goods. Imagine a sub-Saharan African country. You're specialized in production of commodity goods, and you have so many other needs for manufactured goods. You have to import them. Okay? So, if the price of manufactured goods are increasing and the price of your exports is not increasing, you're in trouble. You cannot pay for your import bills. Another piece of evidence. This is the price index for commodities, industrial commodities. And this has a long sweep of history since mid-19th century. And the real price of that, that means taking account of inflation, has been falling. So as a developing country, if you specialize in them, you've been in trouble. The value of your exports have been decreasing and decreasing. You are in a low income generating sector. Any questions? Yes? Yeah.
Any analysis suggests that like the rate at which these prices are falling is also decreasing. As in, it's the way that the price is falling, is that linear or is it falling exponentially?
The answer that I have is that this is a long term, because in the short term you have ups and downs. The price of commodities have been booming in the last 10 years. The trick is that the main answer is that have they been falling in the long term? What is the long term trend? Yes, Luke?
What's the reason for this?
What's the, again, going back to that, you have low marketing power, low power in the market, and also you don't get to produce things that you can brand on a lot. So therefore you cannot charge high prices. But for a manufacturer producer, you can do this. You can relate this manufactured goods to a part of identity and charge a high price. But it's very difficult to do this with agricultural goods. So the price of manufactured goods have been increasing relative to the commodities. Yes? Okay. Now this idea, other people built on the Purbish-Singer idea. They built on it, and they had basically a new school of thought came out of this hypothesis called dependency theory. Very close to Marxist. You had very famous people like Paul Baran, Gunther Frank, and today Immanuel Wallstreet. He's live and kicking today with lots of interesting books, okay? That they built on the same idea. And their idea is the core periphery system of global capitalism today. They say that, look, the global capitalism is made up of 2 parts. Core countries, the industrial countries that specialize in production of manufactured goods, high value added goods, and the rest of the countries, the periphery, that specialize in production of raw materials and commodities. They give raw materials to these countries, they turn those raw materials They process them and they produce manufactured goods with their knowledge and physical capital, and they sell back those goods to periphery. And interestingly, they mentioned that price of these goods have been falling relative to these goods. Okay? So global economy is a form of exploitation for developing countries. They get to specialize in goods that are low value added. Dependency school. Now, they said that this has come a form of a neocolonialism. It reminds you of 19th century. You know, still the same. In the 19th century, you know, rich countries colonized developing countries and forced them to specialize in exports of raw materials. Let's look at it today. Cameroon provides exports to the cotton. This cotton turns into a Zara t-shirt in the rich countries, and then it gets exported back to Cameroon. You provide the raw material to the rich country, they process it, they turn it into a high value added good, they sell this back to you at a much higher price. Same with the iPhone. As a South Africa, you know, you provide the raw material and you buy iPhone in return. A clear example of dependency today. Now, what is the solution? The final part of the lecture. If trade openness is bad and it locks you into agricultural commodities, what do we have to do? The answer is this: state intervention. This is not going to happen automatically because you're locked in here. The state have to actively interfere to encourage structural change and mastering the technology in each of these stages. The state has kind of had to diversify the economy from here to here and then to here by different means. If you want to move here, technological learning takes time. Protect your firms, support your firms first, let them master the skills, let the learning happen at the organizational level, and then expose them to global competition. Once you master this, move to here. In every step, the state will have to help you, protect you behind high tariff barriers, insulate you from global competition, and provide you with a lot of subsidies until you learn the technology. Then, the state has to expose you to the global competition. This idea became very popular after decolonization, after World War II. That look, enough of this dependency relationship, we're going to break away from specialization in agriculture and commodities. As developing countries, we don't want to specialize in raw materials anyway. We want to produce these parts on our own. We want to produce our own steel industry. We want to produce our own cars. We don't want to import cars from you, sell you raw materials and import cars. No, we can do it ourselves. Economic nationalism, the rise of economic nationalism after World War II, a lot of state intervention, state-led industrialization. One of the first countries that followed this method of state-led industrialization, state actively supporting, a structural change from here to here to here, was India. They produced their own cars. Symbol of national pride. They produced their own version of Volkswagen, people's car, car for everyone. They called it ambassador car. Symbol of economic nationalism. We can do it on our own through intervention and support. And then through time, we can compete with the rich world, build our global brands here. This is another example. In the 1970s, this is the Iranian prime minister driving the first car that was produced in Iran as a symbol of nationalism. We can do it ourselves. right? We could produce our cars ourselves. We don't have to import them. Tata Steel plant in India. This was again one of the symbols of national pride and also an important strategic industry in the Cold War. You want to produce your own steel. It's good for defense and it also reduces your dependence on imports. You don't want to import steel. You can do it yourself. Again, a steel industry in Nigeria in 1977. The whole idea of it was that through protectionism and financial support, we can move away from agricultural sector and towards capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive sector. We could stop importing manufactured goods and produce it ourselves. We call this import substitution. We substitute the imports with the domestic production. However, this always has two dangers doing this. Any idea?
Well, if there's too much protectionism, they can get inefficient, corruption, and labor as well.
Yeah. It's like a kid. Too much protection can spoil them. Always protection insulates the Indian firm from global competition. That is what you're taking away from the firms. Remember, competition. You're protecting them behind high tariff barriers in order to give the opportunity for them to learn. However, it's like every other kid. If you do this too much, now you give perverse incentive to the firm. The firm says, look, I'm going to be protected. Why should I focus on technological learning? Why should I focus my energy on mastering technology? I do something else. I focus on getting more protection and financial support from the state. This is the negative incentive, the exact opposite of mastering the technology. May I? Yes. We had another question. Yes.
Yes. Is it possible to have enough competition domestically
Yeah.
so that the international competition?
Very good question. If you're a small country, no, because you have a small market. Like, you cannot have 12 car producers in Peru competing over the internal market. It doesn't make sense. The capacity, the size of the market is not big enough. If you're USA, yes. If you're China, yes. Your internal market is big enough. But sometimes your internal market is not even big enough. You cannot have 12 producers, 10 producers competing with each other. Very good question. Thank you. Yes?
I would just like to say that there's a risk of retaliation from other countries as well.
At the global level.
At the global level.
Like what country? Could you give examples?
So I think it was the case of U.S. Steel and Honduras Bananas.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Now, in the colonialist day, 19th century, the developing countries were not basically allowed to do this because the UK went to India and said, look, you're not allowed to protect your textile industry. Reduce your tariff rates and buy my clothes. So they didn't have the independence actually to do that. However, during the Cold War, there was a levy, okay? US was not the global hegemon like today. So basically, it had to give a little bit of space to developing countries to follow protectionist policies. However, this changed with the collapse of Soviet Union in the 1990s. Now the US is global hegemon. It could pressure much more easier the other countries to open up their economy. Very good. Other questions? So bear in mind, the downside of this is that instead of giving incentive for technological learning, you give the incentive to firm for seeking more favors. Give me more favors. I haven't learned the technology yet. I cannot compete. If you expose me to competition, I have to close down my factory. A lot of people will get unemployed. So give me more favors. Give me more favors. Okay. We call this rent seeking. You're asking favors, rents. So it changes the incentives. You're taking away the competition. So you need to make sure that although you're insulating them, there has to be a degree of competition. Okay? And the countries that perfectly got this right were East Asian countries. And we're going to talk about this next week. How did they intervene and got these things right? The second risk is this. Remember, leapfrogging into capital-intensive industries. You're at the low level of income. You don't have a lot of savings. You want to come up. You want to produce your own steel industry. You want to produce your own car. Something which is very capital-intensive. Something which is very knowledge-intensive. You don't have enough educated workers. You don't have enough savings to do, to produce computer chips. Okay, with economic nationalism, yet it sells a lot, but you need to have the resources for leapfrogging. If you leapfrog, if you suddenly jump, remember there were always two threats, right? You squeeze the domestic consumption, right, in order to have enough savings and investment in machinery. Or the other side of it is that you don't fund your investment from domestic sources. You go to the foreigners and you get a lot of loan from them to build your capital-intensive industries and do the leapfrog. What is the danger of this? Threat of foreign default and debt, the debt crisis. Now let me show you both of these things in two cases that went wrong. First, India, too much competition. In the 70s and too much protectionism in the 1970s and 80s, reducing the incentive of firms which were protected to learn and master the technology and improve their productivity. So this is total factor productivity growth, a measure of technological learning, if you remember. During the periods that were protectionist, in any industry, whether it was consumer goods industry or a capital-intensive industry or a labor-intensive industries, productivity growth was negative in India. Productivity growth, that means technological learning, was negative. They didn't have any incentive to master the technology. Most of the Indian firms focused their effort, the managers focused their effort on getting more favors from the government, not to master the technology and compete globally. Any questions? An example of the second risk, Latin American in the 70s and 80s. Raul Purbish, if you remember, was Argentine. His ideas became very popular in Latin America. His idea was that if you specialize in agriculture and commodities, you're going to be worse off in the long term. You're going to be locked. So, following his ideas, a lot of Latin American countries went for protectionism. They started to diversify into capital-intensive industries and labor-intensive industries. Okay? These industries need a lot of capital. They borrowed from abroad. In the 1970s, they borrowed a lot to basically push their investment in capital-intensive industries at home. And this, in the 1980s, that means eventually 1 decade later, led to Latin American debt crisis. They couldn't repay their loan. So they had to ask for IMF and World Bank to save them. And the IMF and World Bank went there and said, we're going to save you, but get rid of this stupid protectionism thing. If you want us to save us, follow free trade. Open up your economy to trade. And this has been the story in the since 1980s. Many of the countries that followed this strategy ran into trouble. Some of them succeed, like East Asia. We're going to focus on success cases next week. Many of them failed because of these two things. They protected the domestic industries a lot. They spoiled them. Their industries could not compete. And also, they leapfrogged. They borrowed a lot to produce capital-intensive industries. And this led into trouble. In the 1980s, many of the countries ran into trouble. IMF came and said, we're going to rescue you. However, you're going to reduce your tariffs. You're going to open up your economy. This is the tariff rates for developing countries since 1985. a drastic reduction from, let's say, 14%, nowadays 6%. And then you had WTO in 1995, a very strong multinational, international organization that is devoted to reducing tariff rates in every country, and it's highly influenced by the rich countries. So the days that you could protect your industries and do this are sadly over. The option of doing these things are becoming more and more removed from developing countries. In a way, we're witnessing a clear example of kicking away the ladder. When rich countries were developing, they followed this method, protectionism and financial support themselves. But when it comes to developing countries, they don't allow them to do it, kicking away the ladder. Now let me summarize. A lot of material, yeah? We started with the argument that says, if you want technological learning, just open up your economy to trade and investment. Your entrepreneurs will identify the sector that you can compete, they invest in it, they master the technology. And gradually, you move away from agriculture to labor intensive to capital and knowledge intensive. So basically, openness to trade automatically leads to economic development in the long term by ensuring technological learning and gradual structural change. This is the argument for free trade and openness to trade. However, these are the next 3 points are the arguments of opponents to trade openness. The people that says, no, this is not going to happen, we're against that. Advocates of state interventionism. First of all, they say, look, this is not going to happen. The process of structural change and industrial upgrading does not happen automatically through forces of international trade. Each stage needs learning. Learning cannot take place while you're kind of exposed to the international competition. And also they said that openness to trade, if you're a sub-Saharan African country, you open up your country to trade, you remove your tariff barriers and export barriers. The only sectors that you can compete in are agriculture and commodities. The problem with these sectors is that they are low income generating sectors. You have low marketing power on them, and it doesn't produce as goods that you can charge a lot of price because it's not about the identity of the consumer. It's not very valuable in terms of identity and branding, okay? So in a way, you get locked into low-income sectors. So basically, what is the solution? The state needs to intervene in the economy to promote structural change and technological learning. However, the state needs to get this intervention right. And this is what we're going to talk about next week, the successful cases of state intervention in East Asia. Thank you.